of those arguments and how familiar they are or not. What Nick has been talking about, the rise of Christian nationalism in the UK is important, and we'll explore that more. But the dominant discourse comes from the US. So my interest in that is partly theoretical, but it's also the surprise of seeing a pattern of political thinking that has been mostly associated with Roman Catholicism, a very sort of traditionalist Roman Catholicism, being turned to advance a sort of Protestant exclusionary political order. And key figure here is J.D. Vance. Vance has become a Roman Catholic, but he's his own peculiar kind of Roman Catholic. Not good on popes, and had this interesting spat with the late Pope Francis about the Ordo Amoris, the ordering hierarchy of love, okay? Which Vance was using to explain the hierarchy of obligations that we have to others, and giving priority to those closest to us who share very important characteristics, and those who are remote from us with whom we have very weak obligations. Now, of course, in the US context, that's heavily tinged with race, and it's very closely attached to Trump's treatment of immigration. So there's a big story about why this language is being deployed the way it is, and I think its importance is going to grow, partly because of the situation with respect to Mr. Trump, who will be gone at some stage, and there is a fight for the soul of whatever that political project is, and Christian nationalism is a movement there. But also, that's where the money is, and that will have an impact on how Christian nationalism impacts us through the various ways in which US politics shapes particularly the British politics of the right. And I'm thinking of organizations like the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, organizations like National Conservatism, heavily driven by US money, which facilitate voices that will start to appear elsewhere. And of course, Robinson is one of the beneficiaries of one of those wealthy people who's promoting this. So I'm happy to go into that further, but it's where this is coming from and who's promoting it that gives me the sort of negative response, one of fear.
And might you just say something about the Charlie Kirk aspect of this? Do you think that has changed the conversation in America in the last few months or 6 months?
Well, so Kirk is interesting because, I mean, he's been part of the sort of development of this movement as a political movement, Christian nationalism as a political movement in the US, and fell out with other figures on the hard right in the US, and I'm thinking mostly of Nick Fuentes, who's the anti-Semitic supporter of Trump. But there's that sort of separation and struggle on the right in the US, but Vance is core to that, and is looking to pick up some of the space that's been vacated. I mean, I could say very cynical things, but I'm not going to, but some of the space that's been vacated by Kirk. So there's a space for this sort of high-minded but exclusionary nationalism, which has two rhetorics. One is the sort of public one that you take to church communities. The other is the online version, which is much less sort of high-minded and much more politically problematic. So where this is being promoted and how it's being promoted is an important part of how we see movements like Christian nationalism.
Thank you. Theo, you want to come in on, do you want to give your own kind of take on the landscape?
Yeah,
right
sure.
now?
We've already got quite a wide canvas, haven't we, of America and here. That's probably wide enough. But in a way, I wanted to also mention Russia is relevant to this as well. Christian nationalism, they've got a form of it that's, in fact, it got me thinking about the whole issue in a new way with the full invasion of Ukraine. I felt there wasn't quite enough criticism from other Christian leaders of that union of religion and politics, which maybe a lot of us had assumed was a thing from the past, from centuries ago. But I think it's quite healthy just to remember that that's part of the global picture as well, and that the main context we're talking about are quite complicated mixtures of the sort of liberal state and the maybe more conservative union of religion and politics. But in a way, that's quite a sort of full fat version of Christian nationalism. And obviously, if we're going to answer the question literally, they're scared of Christian nationalism there and anyone who lives anywhere near there. We might come back to that if anyone wants to later. But yeah, also the American situation obviously got us all thinking. That rally, I don't know how many of you saw it, after Charlie Kirk died or was killed, was pretty unlike anything one has seen before, I think. And I'm not someone who talks easily about Trump being fascist or anything, but there was something about that rally that made you think they're almost trying to copy the fascist rallies of the 1930s, and why are they doing that? And I think there's an interesting mix of the secular and the religious there. I think in America, we're always known about the religious right, and we're sort of grown up knowing that's part of America. But something somehow changed, I think probably before Trump, with Obama, a reaction to Obama at the Tea Party and that sort of thing. And there was a new energy, maybe based in racism partly or largely. But yeah, I think in a way it was sort of unleashed by Trump. There's sort of good cop, bad cop, something very secular and sort of Nietzschean nationalism freed up the religious right to be more extreme version of itself. And so an example was at that rally, you had the widow, Erica Kirk, forgiving the killer, but then you also had Trump saying, we don't do forgiveness, I hate my enemies. And in a way, I think she was more scary than him, just for being willing to share a stage with someone who says, don't listen to the stuff about love your enemies, and it claiming to be a Christian context. But obviously, also we're talking about the British situation and the Tommy Robinson rally. You might have heard that he's announced a new rally for Christmas carols next week or week after. And in a way, his little statement on that is clearer than ever of this sort of agenda of mixing religion and politics, basically, but claiming it's a religious event. He just wants the nation to do its traditional religion and to be proud of being Christian. But obviously it comes out that there's a sort of protest agenda at the state for impeding that or holding back the people from enjoying their natural religious identity. And that's quite a complicated thing to reflect on. He obviously wants large-scale Christian events that are also shows of nationalist pride. And I think we have to think carefully about how we kind of respond to that. Because it's obviously trying to expose the normal kind of secular liberal culture as suppressing Christianity or something like that, and it's obviously excluding people. But how do we respond as Christians to that? And I think we should respond with care, but also clarity, and say, yes, we should be proud of being Christian, and yes, we should be proud of being British as well. But we shouldn't merge those two things together, because the way that we should be proud of our nation is that it has this ability to combine people of different religions and ethnicities. And in a way, this is just basic liberal stuff that we all half know. But this sort of thing prods us to really think about that in a fresh way, which in a way is quite healthy, that it's the sort of thing for generations we've allowed to sort of be too obvious for words. And we do have to sort of sharpen our thinking about that and try and articulate, well, actually, we have a version of Christianity in this country which is proud to affirm the liberal state, basically, and that guards against that kind of union of religion and politics. And of course, you might reply, well, hang on, we've got an established church, so doesn't that mean we combine religion and politics? And I'd say, well, paradoxically, no, it means the opposite. We've actually got this rather complicated tradition in which, although it started from that unity of religion and politics, of a sort of theocracy of the Tudors or Henry VIII or whatever, actually it learned gradually to undo that and to internalize the liberal state and to affirm it. And so that's something that I think theologians should try and just be a bit more explicit about, rather than just assuming we sort of half know it, it'll all be okay. So I'm not saying it's good to have a rise of Christian nationalism, but I do think, in a way, it might provoke a new sort of era of back to basics, in a way, in a good way, of what does it mean to be liberal type of Christian, that sort of thing.
Thank you. I want to come back to the Christmas carols and the kind of cultural Christianity, but before I do, just to give the microphone back to Nick, who I removed it from, because I think it would be really interesting to hear your response to the way in which both Paul and Theo are suggesting quite a strong American influence on the landscape here. And I'm really interested by your sense in which obviously the ecclesial landscapes are very different. And Theo's been sort of explaining that more for us. But the connections, the political connections between the right in America and the right in the UK seem to be quite strong. The relationships seem to be quite strong at the moment. There was some interesting articles in Politico last year about the academic James Orr in Cambridge and his influence on J.D. Vance as his sort of guru on this side of the pond. And you know, Bannon was here in 2013 organising conferences in Cambridge around Unite the Right. So I'd just love to hear you kind of respond to this sense of the different ecclesial landscapes, but perhaps still an influence from America in this country around the rise of the far right.
So there is undoubtedly a connection and a parallel there, and you're right that there are political connections. Interestingly, I've just written a piece for the Tablet Catholic Weekly on the way in which Reform, the party, is leading quite heavily into a Christian narrative. And you mentioned James Orr there, and Tim Montgomery and Danny Kruger are also very prominent people who have associated themselves with Reform, and prominent Christians who have associated themselves with Reform. And undoubtedly there's American money flowing eastwards. So I'm not for a second suggesting there are no connections there. I guess the point I'm making is that whatever Christian nationalism is, or becomes in this country, it will be sui generis. It will look like British Christian nationalism. And that will be different from various different forms of continental Christian nationalism. I think one of the ironies in this is that actually various Christian nationalist movements aren't particularly nationalist. In continental Europe, it's a lot more about the civilization. It's Christian civilizationism. That's what's going on in Russia. Hungary is the lead candidate for a prominent Christian nationalist country, but Hungary sees itself as the defender of Christian Europe, defender of Christian civilization. So paradoxically, sometimes there's not much nationalism in these movements. One other quick point I'll pick up from Theo's, I think it's critical to emphasize the fact that Christian nationalism, again, whatever it is, coterminous term, by which I mean, to give an example, I was at a meeting in Westminster a few months ago, and a Tory MP, it was a roundtable discussion on this kind of subject, and the Tory MP provocatively said, well, I'm a Christian, and I believe in a nation, and so therefore I guess that makes me a Christian nationalist. And I respond to I don't think that is the case. I don't think it is the fact that, I think Christian nationalism is more than the sum of its parts. You know, Katie Forbes is a prominent nationalist politician in Scotland and a very prominent Christian. I don't think anyone's accused of being Christian nationalist. It's not the fact of being Christian and believing in a nation, whatever that might mean, but a sense that one means the other. That to belong to a nation, you either need to be a Christian or, because they kick it into the long grass a bit, holding Christian or Judeo-Christian values. It's the fact that the two overlap and almost become synonymous. I think that's a characteristic of it.
Thank you. Paul, you were nodding. Did you want to respond?
Yeah, no, I wanted to sort of agree with Nick about the civilizational dimension. I suppose one of the things that puzzles me most about Christian nationalism as a movement is, well, I've kind of mentioned that already, who's driving it. If this is coming up from ordinary Christians out there, that's one thing. But a nationalism, it is an ideology. Ideologies are always prepared and refined by political actors to do things. So the question I always want to try and work out here is, what is this trying to do? And, we all think nation is an easy concept to understand. No, it isn't. It's an invention of the 19th century. It's coterminous with something that looks like a modern state, which of course hasn't been the model for political organization for much of human history. And it doesn't have to be the model for political relationships and ecclesial political relations. I say this as a Roman Catholic. Doesn't have to be the model for ecclesial political relationships going forward. So it's picking something. It's picking a way of identifying an us. And the way nationalism usually does that is by contrasting that with a them. Distinguishing, separating, and giving identification in that way. Now, in processes of decolonization and so on, there's a kind of value for that, making a political entity. But we aren't in that moment. So what then is the point of Christian nationalism as an ism? What is the political agenda that people who deploy it are trying to achieve? And I can say much more on that, but it's the political agenda that's the most important thing in the way in which this is used.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that's interested me in what people have been saying recently is that there's a question about the people who show up to these events, and they may be showing up for all sorts of reasons. What's perhaps even more interesting is the organisers and what's going on there. And, that is to your point about the political agenda. And I think we can be quite cautious about sort of declaring that we know why people are in the crowd and what's brought people to even the Unite rally in September. But what we should be very careful to understand well is what's the agenda of the people organising it. So actually, before handing the mic back to Theo, I'd love to push you a bit more on the political agenda. Sorry, Theo.
Okay, so, in preparation for this, I did a fair bit of reading of American sources. There's a wonderful book by a guy called Stephen Wolfe, who's supposed to be one of the intellectual mentors of J.D. Vance. Wolfe wrote The Case for Christian Nationalism. It's a stunningly bizarre book. It's a kind of mixture of 17th century Calvinism, but through the prism of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract, Machiavelli's The Prince, and Lenin. And the argument here is about using an older discourse about the place of nature and religion within a political context, and how, grace and redemption, completes our natures, but our natures are in some sense given and natural, and our political relationships are from that. So, it's all kind of Aristotle and, traditional conservatism. You know, the state, the political community is a natural product of our natures, which is then distorted by outside forces, and we need to recover that. So it's a very particular conception of the political community, and it's one that brings with it particularity. The point about Christian nationalism is that nationalism is always going to be globally plural. There should be different nations, all providing their own particular answer to Christian groups dealing with the challenges of life, and there's an integrity to the way they do it. Now, why that matters in the United States is it coincides with, you know, the recovery of, for want of a better word, things like states' rights, the possibility of overturning public equality laws at the federal level. And what drives that is race. What drives that is the ability of the state to protect itself by excluding those who are different. And you see that particularly in the way in which, you know, the current regime is looking at immigration control. Why is immigration such a risk? Because it dilutes the identity of a nation. Now, we can argue about whether that's true or not. We can see that as a source of, you know, the fears that people bring. But that's the challenge. That's what they're bringing this to bear on, right? And that's, as I say, you know, the political agenda is the one that's interesting. It's not inclusive. Where, you know, Vance goes against the teaching of my church, he asserts this particularism against, you know, the current teaching, which is to accommodate the claims of immigrants and the weak and the poor and all the sort of wishy-washy liberal Christian stuff that these people don't want. So it's about the drive of nationalism in that story, and then, you know, the big question is, what space does that leave for actual Christianity?
Thank you. Theo, do you want to answer that?
I think one of the interesting things is a sort of changed perception of the United States. I think most of us grew up, you know, knowing about the religious right, definitely, but basically seeing America as the kind of quintessential liberal state. And, you know, there's a big question what that means exactly. But I think we've all been a bit shaken or questioning that sort of assumption, because it seemed so sort of certain that it's got it in its constitution about human rights and freedom and liberty and justice for all and all this sort of thing. So even if you hear about, you know, a form of nationalism or a sort of, I'd call it a desire for theocracy, you know, the desire to bring Christian supremacy and sort of create a Christian nation. Obviously, that's roots right back in, you know, Calvinism and the first settlers in America. But we all assumed that was in the distant past, really, or kept very sidelined by this kind of great visionary liberal state full of all these liberal Democrats, basically, for centuries. But interestingly, that seems to have been an era that's maybe crumbled a bit. And I think maybe one thing we need to reflect on is this kind of anti-liberal turn more widely, that something happened in the mid or late 20th century against this ideology of liberal democracy, or liberalism more widely. Maybe we can discuss, if we want to, what that means. But I think that definitely is something that affected theology. A lot of religious thinkers have been very influential. We've mentioned some of them, and they've had an influence on politics. There's been different sort of movements, but I think in the sort of 80s and 90s, they really sort of took over a lot of academic theology, and a lot of us thought, well, that doesn't matter, it's not going to do anything, who cares about academic theology? But weirdly enough, they did start having an influence on politics. Some of these people, maybe through think tanks and certain politicians. And interestingly, both in this country and America, I think that happened. Maybe the money comes from America, but some of the ideas maybe come from here. So I think we need to sort of think about why this sort of liberal project in religion crumbled a bit in the late 20th century. And is there something to sort of retrieve and rescue from that and revive it? And to my mind, I think we do need a sort of new, simple account of theopolitics, religion and politics. And to my mind, you basically got to choose between a form of religion that merges with the state and believes in a sort of strong merger of those two things, and that's the sort of Constantinian thing if you go right back, and it's also the kind of national churches of the Tudor period, like I said, and some of Roman Catholicism, or nearly all of it, in fact, in its history, though Paul might disagree with that. And just see that as, in a way, the norm. And then there was a counter thing of a more liberal form, a form of Christianity that was, in a way, the new thing of it affirming this new thing of the liberal state. And I think that's something we have to see afresh as something really precious and worth salvaging, because the gravitation is back to this theocratic model of religion and politics coming together, whether that's through an international church of Catholicism or a more national one of orthodoxy or whatever. I think, in a way, of course, there's these fine differences of different types of Christian nationalism, but in a way that doesn't matter too much. It's all gravitating to that model of a theocratic model of religion and politics together. Maybe my fellow panelists think that's rather simplistic, I don't know. But I think we need, in a sense, a new simplisticness of saying, there is an alternative to that gravitation.
Would either of you like to respond briefly, and then I'd like to move us on to a different frame?
I mean, I am sympathetic to what Theo's asking for, but of course, the complex relationship between politics and the sort of historically contingent ways in which that is organized, and the way in which that connects with faith and the organization of faith in terms of faith communities, is always going to be in a kind of tension. I think that's, that in a sense is the sort of secular order we are given before, everything comes to an end with the second coming. We're kind of living in this world of, change.
Tension.
That's it. And to expect this to be neatly organized into something is what I find rather troubling about taking one model of political organization, the nations, and then seeing that.
But it's the liberal state model that demands that openness rather than the...
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And I think if one was to sort of put aside, the grand sort of eschatological point, you've also got just the problem of modernity. What forms of political community are going to be stable in circumstances of modernity?
That is not a small question.
And we live with that because, every candidate change or argument for how we change that, think of Marxist revolution, is always worse. We're living in a world in which the economy does what it does, political communities change, rise, fall, and we have to address that. But we have to address that in the context of this being permanently changing. That's modernity. And the pace of it is perhaps what the populists feel uncomfortable with, and that probably is a causal driver for all sorts of people who come to this concern, just as they come to other particular elements of the populist order. And we have to be aware of what's driving that. But it's many things.
Thank you. Nick, you were going to come in on that.
Just a very quick kind of addition. Self-evidently, we're living in a moment of insecurity and uncertainty. At such times, there's a natural human instinct to pull up the drawbridge and to establish security and certainty. I think, therefore, one of the greatest tasks we have at the moment is to formulate, from my point of view, a theological defence of democracy and a theological defence of pluralism. The idea that there are deep reasons, deep theological reasons, why democracies are good, not just practical ones, that they work or they can work, because the big challenge of the last 20 years is that China has modernised without democratising, and that is a profound challenge, so that there are principled reasons for respecting democracy and principled reasons for respecting pluralism.
Thank you. No, I thought you were saying something. I want to just let you all know that there's going to be plenty of time for questions and conversation, so do be thinking of any questions you might have and hold on to them. But before we move to that, just want to come back to what came out in the sort of opening pieces that you all offered and bring us back there a bit to this question of the rise in numbers of Gen Z coming back into religious, discovering religion, not only the church, but also other religious traditions as well. And this quiet revival that people are talking about. And I'm interested in the Tommy Robinson Christmas carols that you mentioned, Theo, and I think there's a question there about cultural Christianity and whether this is opportunity or threat for the church, and to what extent do we recognise the cultural Christianity that people are seeking, and the people who are, in the context of the church, the people who are coming through the doors of the church, what are these movements telling us about spiritual hunger? And it seems to be that there's something different that people are looking for.
Shall I quickly say something about that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, the whole Tommy Robinson thing is interesting and perplexing and frustrating to me in a particular way, because as a few of you will know, I've been very interested in how we make religion more public and try to create festivals. And I'm not in the Tommy Robinson kind of camp particularly, or at all. But I think just from a Christian point of view, it's something that has bugged me and interested me a lot of how do we create more exciting, fun, festive forms of religion. Because, lovely as churches like this are, there's a certain amount of difficulty of people beyond that culture getting the point and seeing the point, and there's something we need to try and do to break out of the model of church. And so in a way I sort of look at that with a sort of envy of he's suddenly got thousands of people turning up when he says let's turn up for this big festival, and in a way what I'm trying to say is there is a sort of vacuum there that maybe the church failed to fill or failed to do enough things. Because when he says he said the government should be organising this like they do in Poland, with lights coming on with the national colours, and obviously that's a sort of nationalist rally type of Christian event, and that's obviously something that most of us would be uncomfortable with. But there's something positive about the desire to reach out, to do something beyond institutions, to bring new people in, to create more sense of community, festivity. And ideally, I don't think that would overlap with the nation state, but it's quite an interesting question of, can you avoid doing that? If you did a purely Christian, let's say, Easter festival, and thousands of people came to central London, could you avoid it being exclusionary of non-Christian people? Could you avoid it being a sort of show of power in a way? And that's a really complicated question that I don't really know the answer to. But I think what I'm saying is as well as condemning that form of rallies in public, we should maybe think, well, maybe the church itself has been missing a trick. Maybe it should have been trying to engage people more publicly, but without the dubious political element. I don't know if anyone...
I mean, I wonder if one slightly different example of that, but that might answer it, is, from the Church of England's perspective, is our schools. You know, they are public spaces that host people of all religions and none, but they are confidently Christian in their teaching and in their character and in what they do. So I think there is a way in which your Easter festival can avoid being exclusionary, but it demands a confidence, a quiet confidence, a humble confidence on the part of the host, the church, to make that space a welcoming one. But I just to come back a bit, I think what I'm really interested in is that these people who are coming to church more now seem to be looking to some extent for structure and discipline. And for a long time, I think the church has tried to reach out to some of you who are in the church this evening, younger people, by kind of doing the softly approach and the sort of spiritual, not religious, and lots of, you know, gentle ways into church. And yet, a lot of the people who are turning up at church now seem to be seeking more of that structure and discipline. And so I think that's partly behind my question of what do we recognize in them that they are seeking, and is this an opportunity or a threat for the church?
I'll say something about my own church.
Great.
There's a lot of anecdotal evidence to support what you say, particularly young men. But it's anecdotal evidence at the moment. We've just started a project at work looking at, specifically the Church of England actually, the quiet revival phenomenon, young people 18 to 30 to find out, men and women, to find out what. I think that's an element of it, but I suspect there are lots of other things that flow into it. I suspect one of the things is that this is a generation that obviously through COVID has catalysed this in some way or other, but also a generation that Jonathan Haidt, the American psychologist, has baptized the anxious generation. This is his book on the subject, whereby he charts in some detail mental health trends amongst young people, particularly in the US, but over the Western world, showing a marked decrease when the penetration of smartphones reached a certain level in 2012 or so. There's that online world, which probably isn't calculated to improve our mental health, which then got doubled up with COVID, in which, you know, you've actually forced isolation on people for prolonged periods of time, which isn't going to help. So I actually think one of the things, I think your structure point probably is right, but I suspect one of the other drivers is what we might call communion, just basic, intimate, if I can put it that way, contact with other embodied human beings. Yeah. I suspect that's got a bit to do with it.
I was just going to make sort of a small point about, you know, the challenge that return brings to, you know, church communities. I mean, many of those coming forward for vocation in my own church come with a very peculiar countercultural conception of what Catholicism is. You know, I grew up as a child in the post-Vatican II world. All the priests who were around had gone through that transformation. But now you have enormous interest amongst young people in the traditionalist views that were overthrown. Now, you know, there's a certain beauty and, you know, there's a kind of aesthetic style to you know, that world, and that's lovely. And the music is great, and it's lovely to hear people talk Latin and so on. But it's what's being recovered, I think, that this kind of raises. And I think that's true across the board. So what are people coming to? And I suppose this goes to Theo's broader point, is what is it that Christianity is giving to that political context? Is it a sort of safe space for traditionalism? You know, this is a big challenge for us as Roman Catholics, and it's a big challenge you see with respect to the Catholic Bishops' Conference in the US, because they're very, very wealthy, and it's a big challenge for the current Pope, Southside Chicago, who's having to deal with, you know, these different cultural drivers in terms of what it is that Catholicism as a global religious form brings. You know, and it's not all liberal, but it's not all anti-liberal in the sense of its political position. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what is coming with this, engagement and so on. And
that brings us back to Nick's bewilderment.
Yeah.
That he opened with.
And sadly, being honest, there's a certain fear on my part of what's coming within my own church, and I know that's a fault of mine to feel that way about it, because if you kind of believe that this is what the Holy Spirit gives us, if I'm not comfortable with it, so too bad. But there is an institutional element of that.
I think to be a bit more positive about the Church of England, for example, I think in a way we do see that there's still a very robust kind of alternative or resistance to the sort of Tommy Robinson stuff. I mean, no Anglican priests were in that rally, I don't think, or will be at the next one, maybe one or two, I don't know. But basically it's almost taken for granted that the established church of the nation, of course, resists this Christian nationalist movement. In a way, that's quite remarkable and impressive. If you think in a lot of countries, they'd get right on the bandwagon and, own it and be the same thing as it. So in a way, I do feel quite sort of reassured that we do still have this robust, you could call it a sort of inoculation we've got in the Church of England against Christian nationalism, just because it's an established church that's very liberal. And, my main feeling is, okay, that still works, but I don't want to be complacent about it. There's cause for alarm of it maybe breaking at the seams and a new force coming in.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear your optimism, but I think it's there in the Anglican Church in places as well. I mean, a colleague up the road from me has had some real difficulties with members of his congregation and, what he's preaching and what they think about Christian nationalism. So I think it is there, yeah. I want to open this up to our wonderful audience now. You've heard lots. There's lots we haven't even touched on, so you might have questions that you just want to throw out or pick up on anything that you've heard. And we've got a hand gone straight up in the second row there, with the lady there with her hand up. And can I ask you to keep your questions very brief so that we can give time to everybody?
I'll be as quick as I can.
Thank you.
Several things. Thank you to the panel. This is an embarrassing request. The second speaker, I'm so sorry, I've forgotten your name, but please could you speak up? It's very difficult to hear what you've offered, and you've offered such a lot. Nick, I really like the idea of democracy and religion, the mix, and bringing back democracy, which brings back contact with people. I love the idea of some structure, and I'm thinking not necessarily only in the churches, but wider, because people are really lost, especially the younger generation. And I think for me, as an older person, I don't know if this is a question really, but as an older person, maybe a lot, I can offer as a free-thinking spiritual seeker now, is a lot of prayer and compassion and hope for the future. So that's not really a question, but I really, really need to say it, so thank you.
Thank you, and we do need prayer and compassion, that's for sure. Here at front, can you try and formulate it into a question if you can?
Okay, so I really like Theo's idea that we have to kind of match, or we've missed a trick maybe here at sort of like playing them at their own game. Does the panel have any ideas how the church could get behind a kind of liberal rally that brings together people of all colours, transgender, anyone who believes in God, and says, look, we're here too. Could that actually happen? Is that a sort of mad idea?
Should we take 2 or 3 questions? Or do you want
let's take a couple more. Yes, here in the front, second row.
I think I'm interested that you're all in agreement that it's Christian nationalism is a very dangerous thing, and I think for me, coming from a younger perspective, I've always, like growing up, I've definitely got a sense of, my people have always said, there's no English culture, and people have always, there's no, people around me have made fun of Christianity. So I think to me, like there should be some recognition that that's not also, that's also like something, like I've grown up with shame because of that sometimes, or not, or like less confidence in myself, believing that I haven't got a strong identity. And so I think that like recognizing that is also important.
Thank you. Is there one more question before we turn it back to the panel? Yes, here next to you in the front.
Thanks. I just had a question about, you're saying that the church feels kind of uninvolved in these rallies. The government also is condemning these rallies, which is awesome for both of them, but they are still happening and they are still excluding a lot of people and making people feel unsafe, Christians and non-Christians alike. So how is there any kind of solution-oriented space of how can the government or the church or both respond in a way that makes people want to stop the rallies or feel like a safe space in either of those places rather than having to take to the streets in that way?
Thank you. So 3 questions, a bit around how does the public respond? How do we make a good rally? How do we, these different spaces of the political and the church, and then what about those of us who feel that we are English and Christian, and where's the space for that now? Nick, do you want to kick off?
Great questions. So this is the point at which I make a confession to the audience. I'm engaged in a 2-year project at Theos on Christian nationalism. We got the money sort of recently after the September rally, and the December one has come up. And I was challenged and said, you're researching this subject, have you ever engaged with any of these people? And the answer was no. I mean, I've read the academic literature on it. So I'm going on Saturday week. So this is just a warning, just in case you see someone who looks like me on your TV screens. It is me. I'm going to do a bit of ethnographic research. So I'm going to spend time there trying to talk to people to find out why they're going. I've heard lots and lots of reasons why people are going. I suspect many of those reasons are accurate and justifiable, but I want to get an idea of why people are there. I think actually we owe them that, rather than simply to say, this is the reason I know you are there. I think that's the first thing to say. I do think we need to listen. Whatever we think of this phenomenon, straight out, we need to listen. Because it's only by listening that we can formulate a response. Now, to answer your question, I'm a member of various different kind of church WhatsApp groups, or not my church, but other churches that are in the business of formulating a response. We put it this way, putting on alternative rallies, but that's dangerous because then they're doing that rally, we're doing this rally. It's worth watching the 3-minute video they've produced for the December the 13th rally. If you didn't know who was behind it, it's a revival rally. Simple as that. If you didn't know the fact that most of the people who are wearing dog collars there are not part of any formal institutional church that we would recognise, this is about, I mean, they say at the bottom, this is not about Islam, it's not about politics, not about immigration. Maybe, maybe not. But you can't then easily say we're putting an alternative rally when these people are repeatedly saying we are putting Christ into Christmas. So it's boxed some of the churches in. It's difficult. There needs to be a response, and there needs to be a response to make sure that the gospel is not being co-opted for exclusionary ways. But I think the best way of responding is to listen carefully to what are the different elements that are going on there, and then to formulate the response. My anxiety is about going back to Christian nationalism. I am opposed to Christian nationalism in the sense that I think theology does not deify nations in that regard. But I also think Christian nationalism can sometimes be a bit of a dustbin term, I call it, where you hurl in lots of things basically you don't like very much. And going back to what I said earlier, I've written on the way in which Christianity is bound foundational to the culture of Britain and Europe and the West, and I will stand by that, and I'm very proud of it. That doesn't make me a Christian nationalist, although I know in some people's books it puts me adjacent.
Thank you. Theo, Paul, do you want to respond to any of those questions, or can we move on and get some more questions? I'm just aware of time. Are you happy to move on? Are there any more questions? Yes, at the back on my left.
Hi. I recently came across a UKIP rally, which in terms of numbers is probably a bit more fringe than Unite the Kingdom. But it had a lot of Christian imagery and Christian language. But one particularly fascinated me was a sign that read, "Labour are racist against white underage British girls," which I thought was fascinating in many ways. So my question was kind of about the use of gender by the far right. And I think we see it a lot recently in the kind of especially related to immigration, of a kind of this sexual other, and as a threat to the nation. Often hard to work out whether this use of gender is very kind of pivotal to the far right, or in a sense is a melting pot of a lot of other aspects and then becomes quite trivial. Yeah.
Thank you. Right at the far back, by the lights.
Hi. Thank you very much for the conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I'm a bit unwell, so I'm going to try and string together the question a bit. But there was quite a bit of wanting to retrieve the moment of the liberal state and the importance of not embracing the post-liberal moment. And I guess something that, the concerns of reform and other far-right actors were mentioned. And that feels true. However, at the same time, right now, with a Labour government that is not far-right or right-wing, on paper, is centre-left, is talking about suspending jury trials, which is a illiberal, kind of plainly illiberal move, is prescribing priests as terrorists, for taking action on conscience. Again, in my mind, plainly illiberal. If we look back, there's kind of a evergreen illiberal nature in, facet of British politics. The so-called muscular liberalism of Cameron and the Conservative government, also led to austerity. There's a kind of, I guess what I'm saying is, liberalism, I feel like we've never really enjoyed it, actually. I think the Enlightenment ideals and the liberal thinkers who had wonderful ideas always managed to maintain an in-group and an out-group. And the liberal tradition is unfulfilled. So, and I'm not going to labour the point. There's many examples of liberal thinkers who did very illiberal things, for example, keeping slaves. And so I guess if the churches, or Christians if we are trying to recall a tradition, to call upon a tradition to kind of make us steadfast in this moment, is the liberal tradition and the liberal state and the liberal moment of the periods that you guys mentioned the right one? Are there other traditions we can call upon? Christians organized in spite of liberal movements for the abolition of the slave trade, Christian revivalist movements. So I guess I'd like to hear about different Christian traditions that we can also hark upon. And I guess I wanted to kind of problematize a bit the idea of a clean sheet of the liberal tradition and the liberal state.
Thank you. Let's take one more. Do you want to respond to that? Yeah, let's have the person in the front here, yeah.
My question is whether you think this country's got it right in terms of the Christian involvement in the state. So we have 26 bishops in the House of Lords, but as far as I know, we don't have any imams or rabbis. Do you think this should be changed, and do you think there are any other aspects of the state that should have more or less Christian involvement?
Thank you. Excellently concise and clear question. Would you like to respond?
Well, there's some big...
Just don't put it too close to that one.
Okay, there's some big topics there. Yeah, I think on liberalism being a flawed ideology, yeah, it's such a wide thing that of course definitely it is. It's so big that obviously liberal states have been super powerful for centuries, so you know you're going to get disastrous mistakes, human error, human sin, if you like, playing a big part in any powerful bit of history. And that's also true of the recent neoliberalism of, you know, free market capitalism and so on, and also the individualism within liberal culture has its flaws as well. So I think, yes, definitely we need to question the wider sense of liberalism all the time. But having said that, there is something I think fully good about a more minimalist political liberalism, the liberal state, liberal democracy, pluralism, as Nick said. I think we can be pretty absolutist about the fact that pluralism is better than non-pluralism, and we should absolutely defend it. And I think you shouldn't allow criticisms of liberalism in a wide sense to muffle that or to obscure that. So I think maybe we need a sort of pruning away of the wider liberalism and say, okay, what's the core liberalism that we really can get behind and defend? And to me, that's, like I said, that pluralism is better than the lack of religious liberty is how these things started in the 17th century or whatever. You know, that story is a good story and we should defend it. Shall I pass
on to someone else to answer the one about the women? They're coming for our women.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was going to sort of follow up on, you know, there's a big story behind the current move for these large rallies. You know, they've happened really since the 2024 election.
You put the microphone a little bit.
Presumably these issues, sorry, my apologies. Presumably these issues are more long-standing than the last 18 months. You know, these crises have not arisen in the last 18 months. So something is bringing them to the fore, and it's picking up on various kinds of challenges that modern societies will always present us with. That's the basis for thinking that everything is going wrong. So I think there is a political agenda we have to be aware of. I think in response to that, we also have to be aware of, you know, the answer to Tommy Robinson's rallies isn't, you know, why don't we have our own? It's probably to ask, is that the right way of confronting, professing, being part of, you know, the wider Christian, you know, we need a bigger rally. Really? We need a rally where all the Christian denominations get together and they all come, one that's profoundly un-British, very un-English. That's not how we do things. So I think there's an important point about not being drawn into a particular kind of politics because of this political challenge, which is, you know, performative and motivated. I do hear the point the woman at the front made about, you know, there does seem possibly for some a sense of apologizing for being the person you are with the beliefs you have in wider society. The only thing I would ask you to think, you know, we could deal with that with a stronger sense of group identity and a bit of paternalism to protect our beliefs and values. But just ask yourself if confessional views were a condition of citizenship. And I think, you know, we're talking about liberalism this and, you know, what's the problem with liberalism? The fundamental bit for us here and now is that liberal settlement means that citizenship rights and your standing in society is not based on your religious confession. And I think as a sort of a true Christian believer, I think that is actually right. That's not a weakening of the position of faith in society. I'm not going to say it's progress and that we should have had that before and history is getting us to the right, but I actually just think it's right. I don't think political communities should be based, can be based, large-scale political communities can be based on some kind of confessionalism.
Thank you.
We can't do that.
Nick, do you want to, as the one at the think tank, just take the last question about the House of Lords and bishops, and should we have some better representation in the House of Lords? I see Sam hovering, so we are going to start to wrap up, but it would be really good to hear if you have a response for that.
It's a good question. I think it's fair to say nobody would ever purposely design the situation we have at the moment, but it is the situation we have. I'm actually pretty agnostic about bishops in the Lords. I don't see it as a tremendous injustice, as some people do. I'm pretty agnostic about establishment, if I'm honest with you. I'm not a great fan. I feel about it the same way as about Royal Family, really. I mean, I'm not a great fan, but I'm not sure that the upheaval and the change that would be involved in becoming a republic or disestablishing the church is worth the effort, frankly. When it comes to bishops in the Lords, I agree that there is an imbalance there, but I think it's tied up with the fact that 26 bishops sit as right in the House of Lords, in particular that issue. But I think that's actually tied up with the wider question of the function of the House of Lords and the various attempts that have been, failed attempts that have been to reform it over the years and to turn it into a second chamber that is directly elected in some way. I'm not pro that, as it happens, and I know people who've engaged with the Lords who have said that they not only applaud the seriousness with which they engage in their political process, but the fact that they are not directly answerable to the electorate in the same way as MPs are, gives them a capacity to see longer term and to be less vulnerable to immediate political wins. I think a second chamber that had people who are representative, not in a direct elected sense, but representative bodies of civil society and business and community and charitable sector, I think that's quite healthy for democracy. And if that is the second chamber we want, I think it's quite proper for there to be religious representatives within it.
Thank you. I'm going to hand the microphone back to Sam, but to reassure you that there's time for drinks and more conversation, and at least 2 of our panellists will be around to chat. I know that Nick has a train to catch, so you'll have to grab him more quickly on his way out if you want to.
Rugby tackle technically,
yes,
I think.
Exactly. Get any questions into him. But thank you so much for brilliant contributions. That's what makes these events, is when you don't just have 3 people up here talking, but we actually get some back and forth from the audience. So a big thank you for the questions, some of them more difficult than we could completely answer in the time that we had here this evening, but it's been really good to have you all. And Nick Spencer, Paul Kelly and Theo Hobson, thank you very much for giving us so much to think about.
Yeah, a huge thank you to our panel members for offering us a lot of food for thought on this timely topic, and I hope the conversation will go on afterwards. A huge thank you to you all for being here this evening. Your reward is everybody can have a glass of wine afterwards, and then my treasurer tells me after your first glass you're on your own and you're over to suggested donations. But please do stay behind afterwards and carry on the conversation. It's been a really wonderful evening to make space, have a forum for voices and perspectives to be heard. So thank you, and thank you once again to our panel. Pascal said, "Whoever seeks God has already found him." I don't know if you've already found God, but I do know that you have found Seeker's Corner, which is what we are calling these regular get-togethers. Being a seeker doesn't have to mean being agnostic, but also describes what St. Anselm called faith seeking understanding. If you'd like to join us for more of these events, then there's a sign-up list by the door on the way out. So just put your name and your email, and we'll let you know about future events. Finally, we're gathered here during the season of Advent, a time when Christians prepare for the celebration of God's coming among us in the Incarnation, which we celebrate at Christmas. But it's also a time when Christians are reminded that we are preparing for the life of the world to come, a kingdom and rule that is not of this world, but of a God who shows himself in crib and cross. To wait in hope for this heavenly kingdom, however, is not a static waiting for a distant future, but one that we're invited to live in the here and now, as if the kingdom of God has come near. And my hope is that tonight, in listening to the voices and perspectives of one another on the subject of the church's public witness, we've been able to reflect a bit more on how to do this better. So, if I may, I'd like to finish with a prayer for Advent. Almighty God, give us grace to cast away the works of darkness and to put on the armor of light, now in the time of this mortal life, in which your Son, Jesus Christ, came to us in great humility, that on that last day, when he shall come again in his glorious majesty, to judge the living and the dead, we may rise to the life immortal through him who is alive and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Thank you once again for joining us.